The rain poured down steadily, casting a shimmering haze over the dimly lit industrial district. Naomi Carter adjusted the hood of her plain black sweatshirt, pulling it tighter around her head to shield herself from the cold drizzle. Tonight, she wasn't Agent Naomi Carter of the FBI. Tonight, she was simply another nameless woman moving through the shadows of the city. Her presence in this part of town was no accident, it was a calculated risk. Her mission was to meet an informant, someone embedded deep within a smuggling operation that had ties to illegal arms trafficking. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered, but there was always the element of chaos. The warehouses stretched endlessly along the cracked pavement, their rusted metal doors reflecting the dim glow of distant streetlights. Naomi walked briskly, her boots splashing through puddles as her sharp eyes scanned her surroundings. She felt the weight of the small encrypted drive in her pocket, the key to uncovering the next phase of the operation. It contained critical data her informant had managed to extract from the smuggling ring's network, data that could dismantle their operation. The transfer was supposed to be quick, clean, and unnoticed. But Naomi knew better than to expect clean exits in her line of work. As she turned the corner, she spotted her contact, a wiry man in his early 40s, wearing a worn leather jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He stood beneath the flickering light of a broken street lamp, his body language nervous but controlled. Naomi quickened her pace, her instincts already whispering that something wasn't quite right. The area felt too quiet, the kind of silence that suggested someone was watching. She brushed off the thought. Paranoia was a companion she had learned to live with, but she couldn't let it cloud her focus. Agent Carter, the man greeted her in a hushed tone, glancing over his shoulder. "I don't have much time." "They're watching everyone now." Naomi nodded, her voice calm and steady. "Just give me the drive. We'll take it from here." The man hesitated for a moment, as though debating whether to hand over the device. Finally, he reached into his pocket and produced a small, unmarked flash drive. Naomi extended her hand, her eyes locking onto his with a silent assurance. The moment the drive touched her palm, a sense of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The sound of a car engine growling in the distance snapped her attention away. Naomi's body stiffened as her finely tuned instincts kicked in. A patrol car was rolling slowly down the adjacent street, its headlights cutting through the misty rain. She recognized the vehicle's distinct markings, a local precinct cruiser. The driver wasn't supposed to be here. This area had been deliberately chosen for its lack of routine patrols. The car came to a stop, and the driver remained inside for a moment, the silhouette of his head barely visible through the windshield. Naomi's heart rate quickened, though her expression remained calm. She nodded subtly to her informant. "Walk away. Now." The man didn't need to be told twice. He shoved his hands into his pockets and disappeared into the shadows, his hurried steps barely audible over the rain. Naomi slipped the drive into the inner pocket of her jacket and started walking in the opposite direction, her head down, her movements purposeful but inconspicuous. Inside the patrol car, Officer Ryan Steele observed her with narrowed eyes. His shift had been uneventful, just another long night of cruising the streets and suppressing the simmering frustration that had been gnawing at him for years. He hated this district, its decay, its chaos, and, most of all, its people. To Steele, this part of the city was a breeding ground for trouble, a place where rules didn't matter and everyone was suspect. And now, in the middle of his uneventful patrol, he had spotted her, a lone figure in a hoodie, moving with an air of purpose that set off alarm bells in his mind. Steele wasn't a man of patience. His career in law enforcement, had been marked by a string of complaints about excessive force and questionable judgment, but nothing had ever stuck. He knew how to navigate the system, how to frame his actions as justified, and he had no intention of stopping now. As far as he was concerned, this was just another opportunity to exercise control, to assert dominance over someone who didn't belong. "Let's see what you're up to," Steele muttered to himself, pulling his car into gear. Naomi heard the crunch of tires on wet asphalt behind her. She didn't turn around, but she adjusted her pace, her body tense and ready. The cruiser's headlights bathed her in light as it rolled up beside her, the passenger window sliding down with an audible hiss. Steele leaned over, his hand resting on the steering wheel, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Hey you, what are you doing out here?" Naomi didn't stop walking. "Just heading home," she replied evenly, keeping her tone neutral. Steele wasn't satisfied. He pulled the car ahead of her and parked it diagonally across the sidewalk, blocking her path. Naomi stopped, her eyes flicking briefly to the badge on his chest before meeting his gaze. His posture radiated hostility, his lips curling into a sneer. "This isn't the kind of place you just head home from," Steele said, stepping out of the car. He stood tall, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun, a gesture Naomi didn't miss. "You live around here?" Naomi kept her composure. "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. Just passing through." Steele's eyes narrowed. He didn't like her tone, not defiant, but too calm, too collected. It irked him. He took a step closer, the rain dripping off the brim of his hat. "I didn't ask if you were doing anything wrong. I asked if you live around here." Naomi's mind raced. She knew men like him, men who thrived on power trips, who saw anyone who didn't immediately bow to their authority as a threat. She had dealt with them before, and she knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. But she also knew she couldn't afford to blow her cover. "I don't think my exact address is relevant, officer," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Am I being detained?" Steele's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Let's cut the crap. What's in your pockets? Let me see your hands." Naomi slowly raised her hands, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained stoic. Steele's eyes scanned her, searching for any excuse to act. The tension between them crackled like static electricity in the air. "You got ID?" Steele demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. Naomi nodded. "It's in my jacket." "Then take it out." Slowly. Naomi reached into her pocket, pulling out her wallet and flipping it open to reveal a plain driver's license. She didn't show her FBI badge, not yet. Steele snatched the wallet from her hand, his eyes darting over the ID before returning to her face. He didn't trust it. He didn't trust her. "This doesn't explain why you're here," Steele said, tossing the wallet back to her. "And I don't like mysteries. So how about you turn out your pockets and show me what you're hiding?" Naomi took a breath. She was running out of options. If this confrontation went any further, she'd have to reveal her identity, and that would jeopardize not only her mission but also her safety. But Steele wasn't going to back down. His hand tightened on the grip of his gun, and Naomi knew the situation was about to explode. Naomi stood motionless in the rain, her mind racing as Officer Steele's demands escalated. She could see it in his posture, in the sharpness of his voice. This wasn't a routine stop. This was about control, about feeding his simmering anger. She had dealt with men like him before, but this time felt different. The stakes were higher, and her options were dwindling. Every second that passed brought the risk of her mission being blown wide open. "I'm not hiding anything, officer," Naomi said evenly, raising her hands slightly to show compliance. Her voice betrayed no fear, though tension coiled tightly in her chest. I've already shown you my ID. I'm just passing through. Steele sneered, his lips curling as he closed the gap between them. His hand never left the grip of his holstered weapon. Passing through where? This isn't a place you just happen to wander into. People like you don't belong here. Naomi caught the emphasis in his words, people like you. Her jaw tightened, but she refused to give him the reaction he was clearly baiting her for. This wasn't the time to argue, to confront his bigotry. She needed to stay calm, to think strategically. Look, she said, keeping her tone steady, I don't want any trouble. If there's a problem, I'd be happy to clarify, but I haven't done anything wrong. Steele chuckled darkly, the sound devoid of humor. You think I'm stupid, huh? I saw you back there, handing something off to that guy. What was it? Drugs? Stolen goods? Show me what's in your jacket. Naomi hesitated. The encrypted flash drive was tucked securely in her inner pocket, and there was no way she could let Steele see it. Revealing it would jeopardize her entire operation and likely her life. The smuggling ring she was investigating wasn't just any small-time operation. They had connections, resources, and a reputation for eliminating threats. If Steele got his hands on the drive, everything would fall apart. It was nothing, she said carefully. Just a piece of paper. Personal business. Steele's eyes narrowed, his suspicion deepening. He stepped closer, now inches from her, his presence towering and oppressive. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat onto her shoulders as he leaned in, his voice low and menacing. You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood. And I don't believe a damn word you're saying. Naomi's mind raced. She knew where this was headed. If Steele didn't get what he wanted, he'd escalate further. She needed to defuse the situation, but her options were limited. Slowly, she took a step back, her hands still raised in a gesture of surrender. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you'd just let me. Don't move. Steele barked, his hand snapping to his gun. The suddenness of the motion made Naomi freeze. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face calm, her body language non-threatening. Okay, she said softly, her voice firm but measured. I'm not moving. Steele's eyes darted over her, searching for any excuse to act. He wasn't just suspicious, he was angry. Angry that she wasn't scared enough, that she wasn't breaking down or begging. Angry that she was standing her ground without outright defying him. It was a delicate balance, and Naomi could feel it teetering on the edge. Turn around, Steele ordered. Hands on your head. Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment, then complied. She turned slowly, lacing her fingers behind her head as rain trickled down her face. She could hear Steele's boots squelching on the wet pavement as he circled her, his eyes scanning every inch of her as though she were some kind of prey. What's in the jacket? He demanded again. Take it off. Naomi clenched her jaw, the drive's weight suddenly feeling heavier than ever. She couldn't let him find it, but refusing would only make things worse. She needed a distraction, a way to buy time. Listen, officer, she said, keeping her voice calm but firm. I don't want this to escalate. I'm reaching for my phone, okay? I need to make a call. Steele laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the empty street. A call? To who? Your dealer? No, sweetheart, you're not calling anyone. He stepped closer, yanking the hood off her head, his fingers gripping the fabric with unnecessary force. Take the jacket off. Now. Naomi took a deep breath, her mind calculating every possible move. She couldn't risk a physical confrontation, not yet. but she also couldn't let him uncover the drive. Slowly, she began unzipping her jacket, her eyes scanning the area for anything she could use to her advantage. Then, she saw a narrow alley just a few feet away, partially obscured by shadows. If she could just. Before she could finish the thought, Steele's hand shot out, grabbing her arm and yanking her forward. The sudden force made her stumble, her balance momentarily faltering. "You think I'm playing with you?" he growled, his grip tightening. "You think I don't know what you're up to?" Naomi's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. "I'm not resisting, officer," she said, her voice calm despite the fire burning in her chest. "But this is harassment, and you're making a mistake." Steele's face twisted with anger. "A mistake? You're the one making a mistake, walking around here like you own the place. You people think you can just do whatever the hell you want." There it was again, you people. The words hung in the air like poison, but Naomi refused to let them affect her. She had a job to do, and she wouldn't let this man's hatred derail her mission. "Let me explain," she started, but Steele cut her off. "Shut up," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't get to explain anything. You're under arrest." Naomi's heart sank. This wasn't just about harassment anymore, he was escalating, and she knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. She couldn't let him take her in. If she ended up in custody, the drive would be confiscated, her cover blown, and the smuggling ring would go underground. She had to act. As Steele reached for his cuffs, Naomi made her move. With lightning-fast reflexes, she twisted her arm free from his grip, using his momentary surprise to step back. Steele's eyes widened in shock, but the expression quickly turned to rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snarled, his hand flying to his gun. Naomi raised her hands again, her voice sharp but controlled. "Don't do this, officer. You're making a mistake." Steele drew his weapon, pointing it directly at her. The rain gleamed on the barrel, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Naomi's mind raced, her training kicking in as she calculated her next move. She couldn't overpower him, not while he was armed. She needed to outsmart him, to turn the situation to her advantage. "Last chance," Steele said, his voice low and menacing. "Get on the ground or I swear." But before he could finish, a loud crash echoed through the street, cutting him off. Both of them turned instinctively toward the sound. It was coming from the warehouse behind them. Naomi's informant hadn't left the area. Something had gone wrong. Steele's grip on his gun faltered for a split second as his attention shifted, and Naomi saw her opportunity. She acted quickly, stepping to the side and disappearing into the shadows of the alley before he could react. "Hey!" Steele shouted, his voice echoing through the rain-soaked streets. He spun around, scanning the darkness for any sign of her. "Get back here!" But Naomi was already gone, her heart pounding as she navigated the narrow alley. She had the drive, but now the operation was compromised, and Steele wouldn't let this go. She needed to regroup, to find a way to salvage the mission before everything fell apart. Naomi darted through the narrow alley, her breath steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. The rain slickened the ground beneath her feet, and the faint sound of Officer Steele's angry shouts echoed in the distance. Her mind raced as she considered her options. The drive she carried was invaluable, containing information that could dismantle one of the largest arms smuggling operations in the region. But now, the mission was compromised, and she had an enraged cop hunting her down, someone who clearly wasn't following protocol or reason. Steele, meanwhile, was fuming. The fact that she had slipped away from him only fueled his determination. He hadn't just lost control of the situation, he had been humiliated. To him, this wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was personal now. He was going to find her, no matter what it took, and he wasn't going to let her walk away again. Naomi knew she couldn't keep running forever. She needed to find a way to neutralize the situation. She pulled her phone from her pocket, swiping to activate a secure communication channel with her FBI team. Static buzzed in her ear as the line connected. "Control, this is Agent Carter. Operation is compromised. I need extraction," she paused, listening intently as the sound of a distant car engine caught her attention. Her voice sharpened. "I'm being pursued by local law enforcement, Officer Ryan Steeler. He's hostile and escalating. Do not engage local authorities. Repeat, do not engage. I'll handle it." "Copy that, Agent Carter," a calm voice replied over the line. "We'll redirect assets to your location. Hold tight." Naomi ended the call and tucked the phone back into her pocket. She had to think fast. Running would only prolong the inevitable, and calling for backup would delay the mission even further. She needed to regain control of the situation, but she couldn't do it out in the open. She glanced around, spotting the faint glow of a nearby warehouse through the rain. It was part of the smuggling operations infrastructure and unmarked. Abandoned building where she knew the smugglers often stored their shipments. If she could lure Steele inside, she might be able to use the environment to her advantage. With no time to lose, she sprinted toward the warehouse, the shadows swallowing her as she moved. Steele arrived at the mouth of the alley moments later, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. His anger was palpable, his grip on his weapon tight as he scanned the area. He spotted faint footprints in the mud leading toward the warehouse and smirked to himself. "I think you can hide from me, huh?" he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with contempt. "Not a chance." The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal doors slightly ajar. Steele approached cautiously, the sound of rain tapping against the roof, mingling with the distant hum of machinery. He pushed the doors open, his flashlight slicing through the cavernous interior. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of oil and rust. Stacks of wooden crates and steel beams created a labyrinthine layout, offering countless hiding places. Naomi watched him from the shadows, her body pressed against the cold metal of a shipping container. Her breathing was controlled, her movements deliberate. She needed to stay one step ahead of him, to use his arrogance and aggression against him. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about turning the tables. Come out, wherever you are," Steele called mockingly, his voice echoing through the space. He stepped deeper into the warehouse, his flashlight sweeping across the rows of crates. "You think you can run from me? You think you're smarter than me? Let's see how smart you are when I drag you out of here in cuffs." Naomi stayed silent, her mind racing as she mapped out her next move. The warehouse was a maze, and she knew it better than Steele did. She crept along the edge of the container, her footsteps muffled by the damp concrete floor. She spotted a rusted staircase leading to an overhead catwalk and began climbing, careful to keep her movements quiet. Steele continued his search below, his frustration growing with every empty corner he turned. He kicked over a stack of empty crates, the noise reverberating through the space. "You can't hide forever," he shouted, his voice laced with anger. "I'll find you, and when I do, you're going to regret ever messing with me." Naomi reached the catwalk, her vantage point giving her a clear view of Steele as he moved through the warehouse. She crouched low, her eyes tracking his every step. He was reckless, his movements loud and unsubtle. He wasn't just hunting her, he was trying to intimidate her, to force her into making a mistake. But Naomi wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. From her position, she spotted a small lever on the wall below a control switch for one of the overhead cranes. An idea formed in her mind, and she carefully maneuvered toward the lever, staying low to avoid detection. She reached it just as Steele passed beneath the crane, his flashlight aimed at the far end of the warehouse. Naomi pulled the lever, and the crane roared to life, its heavy mechanical arms swinging into motion. Steele whipped around, his flashlight catching the glint of the moving machinery. The sound startled him, and he instinctively raised his gun, scanning for the source of the noise. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice tight with unease. He took a step back, his eyes darting around the space. Naomi used the distraction to her advantage, climbing down from the catwalk and slipping into the shadows. She moved quickly, positioning herself behind a stack of crates near Steele's location. Her movements were precise, her breathing steady. She wasn't just avoiding him now, she was setting the stage. Steele's frustration boiled over as he shouted into the empty warehouse. "Enough of this crap. Come out and face me." His voice echoed, but Naomi didn't respond. Instead, she pushed over a stack of crates behind him, the sound crashing through the space like a thunderclap. Steele spun around, his flashlight jerking wildly as he tried to locate the source of the noise. "Show yourself," he demanded, his tone more desperate now. "Stop playing games." Naomi's voice cut through the darkness, calm and unshaken. "You're out of your depth, Officer Steele." Steele froze, his flashlight whipping in the direction of her voice. "Who the hell do you think you are, huh? You think you're smarter than me? Tougher than me?" Naomi stepped out from the shadows, her posture calm but commanding. She met his gaze head-on, her eyes cold and unwavering. "I think you're in over your head," she said evenly. "And I think you know it." Steele sneered, raising his gun. "Oh, I don't think so. Hands where I can see them." Naomi didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked on his, her voice steady. "Do you have any idea what you're doing right now? Do you even know who I am?" "I don't care who you are," Steele snapped. "You're a criminal, and you're under arrest." Naomi took a slow step forward, her hands still at her sides. "You're making a mistake, Steele. A mistake that's going to cost you more than you realize." Steele's grip on his gun tightened, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. "Last warning. Get on the ground, or I swear." Before he could finish, Naomi moved. She lunged forward with lightning speed, her training kicking in as she disarmed him in a single fluid motion. Steele barely had time to react before she struck, her elbow slamming into his chest and knocking the wind out of him. His gun clattered to the floor as he stumbled backward, gasping for breath. Naomi didn't stop. She followed through with a precise sweep of his legs, sending him crashing to the ground. She pinned him there, her knee pressing into his back as she reached for his radio. "This is Agent Naomi Carter," she said sharply into the device. "Local officer on site has escalated unnecessarily. Situation under control." Steele struggled beneath her, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "Agent, you're lying." Naomi leaned closer, her voice cold. "You should have listened when I told you who I was." She stood, releasing him and stepping back as he scrambled to his feet. But Steele wasn't finished. He glared at her with pure hatred, his fists clenched as he prepared to attack again. "Don't," Naomi warned, her voice like steel. "You're done here." But Steele's pride wouldn't let him back down, and Naomi knew the confrontation was far from over. The tension in the warehouse hung heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Steele's chest heaved with anger and humiliation as he staggered to his feet, his face flushed from the pain and frustration of being overpowered. Naomi stood a few steps away, her posture calm yet alert, every muscle in her body ready to react. Despite her composed exterior, she knew this wasn't over. Steele's pride was too wounded, his ego too fragile to let this confrontation end without retaliation. The muffled sound of a distant engine hummed through the rain outside. Naomi's sharp instincts told her that Steele had called for backup earlier, and her window of time was shrinking rapidly. The flash drive in her jacket burned like a weight against her chest, a constant reminder of what was truly at stake. She couldn't let this derail her mission. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Steele spat, his voice a mixture of rage and disbelief. He took a step toward her, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth, where her elbow had connected moments earlier. "You think you can just assault a cop and walk away?" Naomi didn't flinch. Her voice was firm but measured, designed to de-escalate. "You escalated this, Steele. I gave you every opportunity to step back." "Bullshit." Steele barked, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "You're a liar and a criminal. That badge, your ID, it's all fake. You think you can intimidate me with your little tricks." Naomi met his glare, her expression unyielding. "You're not listening, officer. I'm trying to prevent a situation that's bigger than either of us. But you're too busy playing the hero to realize it." Steele's lip curled in a sneer. "What situation? What the hell are you talking about?" Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing her options. She didn't trust Steele, not with the details of her operation, not with anything. But maybe, just maybe, she could use his need for control to her advantage. She decided to give him just enough information to make him pause, to make him question. "There's an arms smuggling operation running out of this warehouse," she said, her tone low but firm. "The people behind it are dangerous, and the evidence I have on this drive," she tapped her jacket, "is the key to bringing them down. If you want to be useful, you'll step aside and let me finish my job." Steele's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering behind his anger. For a brief moment she thought he might listen, but then he shook his head, his sneer returning. "You expect me to believe that? A bunch of bullshit about smugglers. You're just trying to cover your ass." Naomi sighed inwardly. She had anticipated his response, but she had hoped for better. Still, she knew she had planted a seed of doubt, and that might be enough. "Think about it, Steele," she said, her voice cutting through his bluster. "If I'm lying, why am I still here? Why haven't I run?" Steele opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside cut him off. Both of them turned toward the open warehouse doors as the beam of headlights pierced through the rain. Naomi's stomach tightened. More cops. 2 squad cars pulled up, their doors slamming in unison as 3 officers stepped out. Steele straightened, his posture shifting as he realized he had an audience now. He waved them over, his confidence swelling with the arrival of reinforcements. "Right on time," he muttered, glancing back at Naomi with a smug expression. "Let's see how tough you are now." The other officers approached cautiously, their hands resting on their belts. The leader, a grizzled man with a thick mustache and a nameplate reading Sergeant Michaels, looked between Steele and Naomi with a frown. "What's going on here, Steele?" Michaels asked, his voice steady but tinged with irritation. "We got your call about a dangerous suspect. Care to explain?" Steele gestured toward Naomi, his tone dripping with contempt. "She assaulted me, resisted arrest, and claims to be some kind of federal agent. I don't buy it. She's hiding something." Naomi took a step forward, raising her hands to show she wasn't a threat. "Sergeant, my name is Naomi Carter. I'm with the FBI, working undercover on a classified operation. This officer," she glanced at Steele, "has compromised my mission and endangered both of us." Michaels raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "FBI? Do you have any proof of that?" "I do," Naomi said, reaching into her jacket. "If you'll allow me to." "Don't listen to her," Steele interrupted, his voice rising. "She's lying. I caught her handing off something to a suspect, and she's carrying a fake badge. She's probably part of the smuggling ring she's talking about." Naomi's patience was wearing thin. "Sergeant, I'm trying to stop an arms deal that's happening here tonight. The people involved are violent and well-connected. If we don't act now, they'll get away. Michael studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded toward Steele. Let her show me her credentials. Steele bristled. You can't be serious, Michaels. She. Enough, Steele. Michael snapped, his tone sharp. If she's lying, we'll deal with it. But if she's telling the truth, we can't afford to screw this up. Naomi reached into her jacket slowly, her movements deliberate, and pulled out her FBI badge. She handed it to Michaels, who examined it closely. His frown deepened, but he said nothing as he handed it back. She checks out, he said finally, glancing at Steele. At least for now. Steele's face turned red with anger, but Michaels ignored him. Carter, if what you're saying is true, then we need to secure this area and call for backup. Naomi shook her head. No time. The deal is already in motion. We need to move quietly and intercept the shipment before it leaves. Michaels hesitated, clearly weighing his options. But before he could respond, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Everyone froze, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. What the hell was that? One of the younger officers muttered, his eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Naomi's stomach sank. It was starting. She turned to Michaels, her voice urgent. They're here. You need to stay back and let me handle this. Steele scoffed. Not a chance. If there's a deal going down, we're shutting it down right now. Naomi didn't have time to argue. She turned and sprinted toward the sound, her mind focused on the mission. Behind her, she could hear Steele and the other officers following, their boots pounding against the wet concrete. She reached the far end of the warehouse and saw them 3 men unloading crates from the back of a black van. They were armed, their movements efficient and practiced. Naomi recognized one of them immediately, Marco Reyes, a mid-level player in the smuggling ring with a reputation for violence. Reyes looked up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her. Who the hell? Naomi didn't give him a chance to finish. She raised her hands, showing she wasn't armed. Reyes, we need to talk. Reyes tilted his head, a smirk playing on his lips. Talk. Lady, I don't know who you are, but you've got about 10 seconds to get out of here before I make you regret it. Steele and the other officers burst onto the scene, their guns drawn. Police. Hands in the air. Steele bellowed, his voice cracking with authority. Reyes' smirk vanished, replaced by a cold glare. He raised his weapon, and all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Naomi dove behind a stack of crates, her heart pounding as bullets splintered the wood around her. She cursed under her breath. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Steele, fall back, she shouted, but he ignored her, his ego driving him forward. He fired wildly, his shots missing their targets and ricocheting off the walls. Naomi knew she had to act fast. The deal was crumbling, and if Reyes got away, everything would be lost. She gritted her teeth and prepared to make her move. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and sweat as the chaotic gunfight raged on. Naomi crouched low behind the splintered remains of a crate, her mind working overtime to process the situation. This was supposed to be a quiet operation, a swift exchange of information leading to a larger takedown. But now, the smuggling ring, the local police, and her own operation had collided in a cacophony of violence and miscommunication. Naomi peeked over the edge of the crate. Marco Reyes barked orders at his men, his voice cutting through the noise. 2 of his goons were using the van as cover, laying down suppressive fire with automatic weapons. Reyes himself was already retreating toward a side exit, a metal briefcase clutched in one hand. Naomi's stomach tightened. She knew that briefcase likely held critical intel on the smuggling network. If he escaped with it, months of work would go up in smoke. Across the warehouse, Steele was pinned behind a steel pillar, firing blindly in Reyes's direction. His shots missed wildly, ricocheting off walls and creating sparks in the dimly lit space. The other officers scrambled for cover, their inexperience glaringly obvious as they struggled to return fire effectively. Naomi gritted her teeth. If she didn't take control, someone was going to get killed, and it wouldn't be the smugglers. She glanced at a small, rusted ladder leading up to an overhead catwalk. If she could gain the high ground, she'd have a clear line of sight on Reyes. But getting there would mean exposing herself to fire, and she couldn't trust the police to cover her. Still, she didn't have a choice. Every second counted. Taking a deep breath, Naomi bolted from her cover, sprinting across the open floor toward the ladder. Gunfire erupted around her, bullets zipping past so close she could feel the air shift. She reached the ladder and began climbing, her movements swift and precise despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Steele noticed her ascent and shouted after her. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" he yelled, his voice hoarse from shouting. Naomi didn't answer. She reached the catwalk and dropped to a crouch, steadying herself. From this vantage point, she could see the entire warehouse, the smugglers huddled behind the van, the scattered police officers trying to regroup, and Reyes slipping further toward the exit. She pulled her sidearm, aiming carefully. Her focus locked onto Reyes, her finger tightening on the trigger. But just as she was about to fire, Steele's voice cut through the chaos again. "Carter, stand down," he bellowed, his gun still firing erratically at the smugglers. "You're not in charge here." Naomi clenched her jaw, forcing herself to block out his voice. Steele's arrogance and inability to read the situation were putting everyone in danger. She adjusted her aim and fired a single shot. The bullet hit its mark, striking the van's rear tire and sending it crashing to the ground with a loud thud. The sudden motion threw the smugglers off balance, disrupting their line of fire. Reyes snapped his head toward the sound, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Naomi on the catwalk. "You've got guts, lady," he muttered, raising his pistol. He fired 2 quick shots, forcing Naomi to duck behind a steel beam. The bullets ricocheted off the metal with a sharp clang, but she stayed focused. "You don't have to do this, Reyes," Naomi called out, her voice cutting through the din. "You know how this ends. Surrender now, and maybe I can get you a deal." Reyes laughed, the sound bitter and cold. "A deal? With the feds? I'd rather die." Naomi sighed. She didn't expect him to listen, but it was worth a try. She peeked out from her cover, her eyes darting toward the briefcase. If she could disable him long enough to grab it, she might still salvage the mission. But Reyes wasn't going down without a fight. Meanwhile, Steele was losing whatever composure he had left. Seeing Naomi take the lead infuriated him, and her disregard for his authority only added fuel to the fire. He fired another round at the van, his aim erratic and unfocused. One of Reyes's men returned fire, and the bullet grazed Steele's shoulder, spinning him backward. He stumbled, cursing loudly as blood seeped through his uniform. Michaels, the senior officer on the scene, shouted over the gunfire. "Steele, fall back. You're hit." Steele ignored him, his focus locked on Naomi. He couldn't stand the thought of her taking control, of her outshining him in front of his peers. He staggered to his feet, his face twisted with rage, and pointed his gun toward the catwalk. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You think you can just walk in here and take over?" Naomi froze for a split second, realizing what was happening. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto Steele's trembling hand as he aimed directly at her. "Steele, Put the gun down, she said, her voice calm but firm. You're making a mistake. I'm not the one making mistakes, Steele shouted, his finger tightening on the trigger. You think you're so smart, so untouchable, but you're just another criminal playing dress up. Before Steele could fire, another loud crash echoed through the warehouse. A forklift, abandoned in the chaos, tipped over and slammed into a stack of crates, sending them tumbling to the ground. The noise jolted Steele, and his aim wavered. Naomi seized the moment, ducking behind cover as the crates exploded into splinters. The distraction was enough to shift the momentum. Rise took advantage of the chaos, sprinting toward the exit with the briefcase in hand. Naomi saw him moving and bolted along the catwalk, determined to cut him off before he disappeared into the night. She leapt down from the catwalk, landing in a crouch as pain shot through her knees. She gritted her teeth and pushed forward, her focus razor sharp. "Stop!" she shouted, raising her weapon. Rise glanced over his shoulder, his expression a mix of defiance and desperation. "Not today, lady," he snarled, ducking into a side corridor. Naomi cursed under her breath and gave chase, her boots pounding against the concrete floor. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, lined with old machinery and discarded pallets. She could hear Reyes's footsteps ahead, his pace quick but uneven. He was tiring, but so was she. Behind her, the sound of gunfire faded as Steele, and the other officers tried to secure the remaining smugglers. Naomi knew she was on her own now. It was just her and Reyes, and she couldn't afford to let him slip away. Reyes rounded a corner, and Naomi followed, her weapon at the ready. She spotted him at the end of the hallway, fumbling with a metal door that led outside. He turned, his face twisted with frustration as he raised his pistol and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make Naomi hesitate. She ducked behind a stack of crates, her breath coming in short bursts. "Rise, give it up," she called out. "You're out of time." "Go to hell," Rise shouted back, firing another shot. The bullet pinged off the metal frame of the crate, inches from Naomi's head. Naomi steadied herself, her hands tightening around her weapon. She couldn't wait any longer. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the crate and fired 2 precise shots. The first struck Rise in the shoulder, spinning him backward and forcing him to drop his weapon. The second hit the briefcase, sending it skidding across the floor. Rise collapsed against the wall, clutching his shoulder and groaning in pain. Naomi approached cautiously, her gun still trained on him. She kicked his weapon out of reach and knelt to retrieve the briefcase. "It's over," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Don't make it worse for yourself." Rise glared at her, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he spat. "You think this is over? You don't know a damn thing." Naomi ignored his words, her focus shifting to the briefcase. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding as she scanned the contents. Inside was a tablet, its screen displaying a series of encrypted files. This was the intel she needed to dismantle the entire operation. But before she could process the victory, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind her. She turned sharply, her gun rising instinctively. Steele stood at the other end of the corridor, his face twisted with fury. His shoulder was bleeding, but he didn't seem to notice. His gun was raised, aimed directly at Naomi. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" Steele growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Steele, lower your weapon. This isn't about you." Steele took a step forward, his hands shaking but his aim steady. "It's always about people like you, thinking you can do whatever you want, thinking the rules don't apply to you." "Look around you," Naomi said, her voice sharp. "The only one breaking the rules here is you." The tension crackled between them, thick and suffocating. Naomi knew she was out of options. Steele wasn't going to back down, and she couldn't afford to hesitate. She tightened her grip on her weapon, preparing for whatever came next. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of a much darker fight. The corridor stretched long and narrow, the flickering overhead lights casting jagged shadows across old cold concrete walls. Naomi's gun remained locked on Steele, her grip steady but her mind racing. The tension between them was electric, each second stretching into eternity. Behind her, Marco Reyes lay slumped against the wall, blood pooling beneath his wounded shoulder. The briefcase sat just out of reach, its precious contents still intact. But Naomi knew she couldn't focus on Reyes now. Steele was the immediate threat. "You've gone too far, Steele," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the suffocating silence. "Put the gun down before you make this worse." Steele's face was a mask of rage, his eyes bloodshot and wild. His shoulder wound bled freely, staining his uniform, but he didn't seem to notice or care. His gun remained fixed on Naomi, his hands trembling ever so slightly. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he snarled. "You think you're better than me? You're nothing. Just another thug hiding behind a badge." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. Steele's words were designed to provoke, to distract her. She wouldn't let him win. "This isn't about me, Steele," she said calmly. "This is about you. You've lost control, and you're about to make a decision you can't take back." "Shut up," Steele barked, his voice cracking. He took a step forward, the barrel of his gun glinting under the weak light. "You don't know a damn thing about me. You don't know what I've been through." "I know enough," Naomi replied, her tone unwavering. "You're scared, you're angry, and you're blaming me because it's easier than facing the truth." Steele faltered for a split second, his expression flickering with something that might have been doubt. But the moment passed, and his grip on the gun tightened. "You don't get to psychoanalyze me, lady. You're under arrest. And if you don't drop that weapon right now, I swear—" "You'll do what?" Naomi interrupted, her voice cold as steel. "Shoot me, in front of a wounded suspect and your fellow officers. Do you really think you'll walk away from this?" Steele hesitated, his eyes darting toward Reyes, who was groaning softly in pain. Naomi seized the opportunity, stepping forward just enough to assert her presence without appearing threatening. Her gun stayed trained on Steele, but her tone softened ever so slightly. "Steele," she said, her voice steady. "This is your chance to stop. Put the gun down and I'll make sure you get a fair hearing. But if you pull that trigger, there's no coming back." For a brief moment, it seemed as though Steele might relent. His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But then his gaze hardened, and his sneer returned. "You think I care about fair? You think I care about any of this? You don't know what it's like to be stuck cleaning up this city's garbage day after day, while people like you swoop in and act like heroes." Naomi's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her emotions in check. She could see the storm raging behind Steele's eyes, the desperation that drove him. But she also knew he was teetering on the edge of no return. Before she could respond, Steele lunged. His gun hand jerked upward, the muzzle flashing as he fired. Naomi moved instinctively, twisting to the side as the bullet grazed past her shoulder, tearing through her jacket, but missing flesh. She didn't hesitate, her training kicked in, and she returned fire, aiming low. The shot struck Steele in the leg, sending him collapsing to one knee with a cry of pain. His gun clattered to the floor, spinning out of reach. Naomi moved swiftly, kicking the weapon further away as she closed the distance between them. She trained her gun on him, her breathing heavy but controlled. "Don't move," she warned, her voice sharp. Steele glared up at her, his face pale from the pain but still defiant. "Go ahead," he spat. "Pull the trigger. Finish it." Naomi's finger hovered over the trigger, her mind a whirlwind of emotion. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the temptation to end it all, to silence Steele's hatred and arrogance once and for all. But she knew better. Killing him wouldn't solve anything. It would only make her like him. Instead, she stepped back, lowering her gun slightly. "You're not worth it," she said coldly. Before Steele could respond, a sudden noise behind them drew Naomi's attention. She spun around just in time to see Reyes struggling to his feet, his face twisted with pain and determination. His good hand reached for the briefcase, dragging it closer as he staggered toward the side exit. "Rise," Naomi shouted, raising her weapon again. "Don't move." But Reyes ignored her, his focus singular. He reached the exit and shoved it open, the night air rushing in as rain poured down in sheets. Naomi cursed under her breath and sprinted after him, leaving Steele behind. The side exit led to a narrow loading dock, where a black SUV idled with its engine running. Reyes limped toward the vehicle, the briefcase clutched tightly to his chest. The driver, a shadowy figure obscured by the rain, stepped out and opened the passenger door. Naomi emerged onto the dock, her gun raised. "Stop right there," she commanded, her voice cutting through the storm. Reyes turned, his eyes wild with desperation. "You're too late, lady," he said, his voice hoarse. "You can't stop this." Naomi didn't answer. Her focus was razor sharp, her sights locked onto Reyes. The driver hesitated, glancing between Reyes and Naomi before retreating back into the SUV. Reyes threw the briefcase into the open door and tried to climb in after it. But Naomi fired a warning shot, the bullet slamming into the metal frame of the vehicle. "I said stop," she barked. Reyes froze, his hands raised slightly in surrender. The driver gunned the engine, clearly debating whether to flee, but Naomi stepped closer, her weapon unwavering. "This is over," she said, her voice low and firm. "Get out of the car. Both of you." The driver hesitated, then slowly stepped out, his hands raised. Naomi gestured for him to kneel, her movements efficient and controlled. Reyes, still clutching his wounded shoulder, collapsed onto the wet pavement, his energy spent. Naomi retrieved the briefcase, her pulse still racing. She glanced around, her instincts on high alert. The warehouse loomed behind her, and she knew Steele wasn't far. The mission was technically complete, but the fallout was far from over. As she secured Reyes and the driver, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Backup had finally arrived, both her FBI team and local law enforcement. Naomi straightened, her body aching from the night's events, but her resolve unshaken. She turned to see Steele limping out of the warehouse, supported by two of his fellow officers. His face was a mixture of pain and fury, but he said nothing as their eyes met. Naomi handed the briefcase to one of her team members, who nodded in silent understanding. "Secure the suspects," she instructed, her voice calm but authoritative, "and get this evidence processed immediately." As Steele was loaded into a waiting ambulance, Naomi couldn't help but feel a pang of satisfaction. He had been brought down not by violence, but by his own hubris. She had done her job, and now it was up to the system to handle the rest. But as she stood there in the rain, watching the chaos slowly dissipate, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The battle against corruption, prejudice, and greed was far from over, and she was ready for whatever came next. The storm had finally begun to ease, but the air was still heavy with the aftermath of the chaos that had unfolded. The warehouse was now surrounded by flashing red and blue lights as police cars, ambulances, and unmarked FBI vehicles crowded the scene. Naomi stood near one of the squad cars, her jacket torn and her shoulder throbbing from the earlier graze. Yet her posture was upright, her expression calm and unyielding. The mission was over, but the fallout was just beginning. Steele sat on a stretcher nearby, a medic wrapping his wounded leg. His face was pale, his pride shattered, but his eyes still burned with resentment as they flicked toward Naomi. He hadn't said a word since being escorted from the warehouse, but his clenched fists and stiff posture spoke volumes. Naomi met his gaze briefly, her expression neutral. She didn't need to say anything. His failure was punishment enough. Across the lot, Marco Reyes and the driver were being loaded into a police van, their hands cuffed behind their backs. Reyes shot Naomi a glare as he was pushed inside, but she ignored him. The briefcase, now secured in an evidence bag, was in the hands of one of her colleagues, who nodded at her before heading toward waiting FBI vehicle. The intel was safe, and the smuggling network would soon face the full weight of federal prosecution. Naomi exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest finally beginning to loosen. The mission had been salvaged, but at a cost. Steele's reckless behavior had endangered lives, compromised her operation, and nearly let Reyes escape. And while she had managed to regain control, the incident left a bitter taste in her mouth. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that allowed people like Steele to thrive. "Agent Carter," a familiar voice called out. Naomi turned to see her supervisor, Special Agent Victoria Mills, approaching. Mills was a tall woman in her 50s, her presence commanding even in the chaotic scene. Her sharp eyes swept over Naomi, taking in her disheveled appearance and the controlled fire in her expression. "Victoria," Naomi greeted, her tone professional but tinged with fatigue. Mills stopped in front of her, crossing her arms. "You look like hell." "Thanks," Naomi replied dryly. "It's been one of those nights." Mills glanced toward the warehouse, where officers were still securing the scene. "I read your preliminary report on the way here. Sounds like Steele nearly blew the whole operation." Naomi nodded, her jaw tightening. "He did more than that. His arrogance and prejudice put everyone in danger. If I hadn't intervened, Reyes would have gotten away." Mills studied her for a moment, then sighed. "We'll handle Steele. Internal affairs is already on their way. With everything that happened tonight, he's done. But this isn't just about him, is it?" Naomi shook her head. "No, Steele is a symptom, not the disease. This whole system is broken. People like him shouldn't have a badge, let alone a gun." Mills nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "You're not wrong. And we'll make sure this incident leads to consequences. But you need to focus on what you accomplished tonight. You stopped Reyes. You secured the intel. That's a win." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She appreciated Mills' attempt to reframe the situation, but it wasn't that simple. Wins like this felt hollow when they came at such a cost. Still, she nodded. Understood. As Mills walked away, Naomi turned her attention back to Steele. He was being loaded into the back of an ambulance, his face a mixture of pain and humiliation. One of his fellow officers approached Naomi hesitantly. A young man who looked like he was barely out of the academy. His nervous energy was palpable as he shifted on his feet. "Agent Carter," he said, his voice unsure. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened tonight. Steele, he's been like this for a while. A lot of us knew, but, well." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp. "But what?" The young officer hesitated, then looked down at his boots. We didn't think it was our place to say anything. He's been on the force for years, and, well, you know how it is. Naomi's eyes hardened. Yeah, I know exactly how it is. And that's the problem. The officer flinched, but Naomi softened slightly. Listen, she said, her voice firm but less harsh. If you want to make a difference, start speaking up. This isn't just about Steele, it's about everyone who lets people like him get away with it. You have a responsibility. Don't forget that. The officer nodded quickly, his face flushed. Yes, ma'am, I won't. Naomi watched him walk away, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. An hour later, the scene had quieted. Most of the officers and agents had left, the area cordoned off and secured. Naomi stood by her car, staring out at the rain-slicked street as she replayed the night's events in her mind. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her with an ache in her shoulder and a heaviness in her chest. She'd done her job, but the victory felt hollow. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen, a text from Mills. Steele's officially suspended. Iowa will handle the rest. Good work tonight. Naomi stared at the message for a long moment before tucking her phone away. Good work. The words felt inadequate. She wasn't looking for praise, she was looking for change. And she knew that wouldn't come easily. Sliding into the driver's seat, Naomi started the engine and pulled away from the warehouse. The streets were quiet now. The storm reduced to a gentle drizzle. As she drove, her mind drifted to what came next. The fight wasn't over, not for Reyes, not for Steele, and not for the system that had enabled both of them. But she was ready. The next morning, Naomi sat in a small conference room at FBI headquarters, surrounded by her team. The briefcase was open on the table, its contents spread out as analysts pored over the encrypted files. The air buzzed with quiet urgency as they worked to unravel the smuggling ring's operations. Mills entered the room, a file folder in hand. We've got confirmation, she announced. The intel from the briefcase links Rise to a larger network operating out of the West Coast. This is bigger than we thought. Naomi nodded, her focus sharpening. What's our next move? We'll mobilize teams to follow the leads, Mills said. She paused, her gaze steady. And we'll make sure your report on Steele's actions gets to the right people. This won't be swept under the rug. Naomi appreciated the sentiment, but she wasn't naive. It'll take more than a report to fix this, she said. But it's a start. Mills smiled faintly. You've got fire, Carter. Don't lose it. As Mills left the room, Naomi leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the documents on the table. The mission had been a success, but the work was far from over. There were more battles to fight, more injustices to confront, and she would be ready for all of them. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger, and she wasn't done yet.